Hi there. Welcome back to our Bio24 lecture series. This one we're going to be talking about two different topics that are pretty closely related. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the calorie restriction diet, and then that's going to be followed by a discussion about nutrition. The calorie restriction diet is a specific kind of diet that is based on the hypothesis that by limiting calorie intake while still maintaining all the nutrients required for life, we can live a longer, happier life. And through that entire time, we would be healthy nearly the whole time. This life could be up to 50% longer based on a lot of statistical studies done on model organisms. The important thing to note here is that this is not just calorie restriction, but also maintaining all of the nutrient requirements for life. So getting all of the fats, all of the sugars that are needed for life, in addition to other nutrients that you might be familiar with, such as calcium and vitamin A and B and so forth. Importantly, this is not an eating disorder. The Calorie Restriction Diet Society that we'll talk about in a moment really wants to emphasize that the calorie restriction diet is not based on outward appearance at all, but is in fact instead based on overall health and lifespan or longevity. Eating disorders are connected generally to low self-esteem, whereas the calorie restriction diet, the society claims, is based more on wanting to improve your overall health and has nothing to do with looks. Importantly, many diets also do not monitor nutrient levels, but instead focus on just macronutrients, such as like eliminating all carbs from the diet or reducing the total number of fat intake, whereas calorie restriction diet is heavily regulated, and we'll talk briefly about that as well. The calorie restriction diet has been tested on many organisms. These organisms are model organisms, such as yeast cells, single-celled fungi, flies, fruit flies in particular. That includes Drosophila melanogaster, which is our model organism fruit fly. Fruit flies and worms, such as C. elegans or Cenorhabditis elegans, are two organisms that scientists use to study multicellular organisms. And so they're a very basic, very simple type of multicellular organism that scientists use to understand a little bit more information about life. But if we want to see how the calorie restriction diet works on mammals, we would need to focus more on rats and mice. And it turns out the calorie restriction diet works on them as well. That's actually what this graph comes from, is a study on rats. Rats, they found, can live twice as long as a typical rat if you reduce their calories by 50 to 60%, that you can see from this graph here. If we really want to see if the calorie restriction diet works on humans, but not quite tested on humans just yet, we of course can run these tests on primates. So here you have a scientific study done on rhesus monkeys. And they did this just on a handful of rhesus monkeys, but here's two that you can see, Kanto 25 and Owen 26. So these are roughly similar in age. However, Kanto that you can see here does, if you're familiar with what the rhesus monkey should look like, looks very good for a rhesus monkey at 25 and is aging fairly well, as they state in this picture. Whereas poor Owen is possibly not doing as well. What they did here in this study is, as you can see, they provided these primates with food pellets, and Kanto was able to eat 445 calories of food pellets, whereas Owen ate almost twice as much, 885 every day. This would be the equivalent, as they mention in the article, of these types of breakfasts, and it's sort of worthwhile taking a look at what type of breakfasts this would be equivalent to. So Kanto is eating fermented soybeans and garlic for breakfast, tofu, konnyaku, which is a green, leafy green vegetable, and carrots for lunch, and then for dinner, a vegan sausage, kale, tomato sauce, and salad. Whereas Owen would have more of a typical American diet of bacon, eggs, and toast with butter for breakfast, a hamburger and French fries for lunch, and then a steak and mashed potatoes and corn for dinner. We have been able to measure improved health and overall longevity in these primates, but we can also run the calorie restriction diet on people. And these studies were only based on a few years of the calorie restriction diet on humans. So we haven't been able to see that the calorie restriction diet actually helps to keep people alive longer. But what we can show is through scientific studies is that it does help with overall health in the short term. So here we have a calorie restriction person versus a control. Some of the measures of overall health, if you're not familiar with it, when you get older, you'll get tested for these things on a semi-regular basis, but they'll test you for your total cholesterol. The LDL cholesterol is the less healthy version of the cholesterol, whereas HDL is a healthy cholesterol. And you can see that the HDL is actually higher in the calorie restricted person, but that's okay because that's the healthy cholesterol versus the less healthy cholesterol, the LDL. Overall, total cholesterol is also lower, as you can see. We also have triglyceride levels, which is a measure of the amount of fat floating through your bloodstream. Fat, as we'll talk about in this section of the course, is involved in forming blood clots or plaques in your blood vessels. And these plaques can build up in your arteries and veins and block blood flow, leading to heart attack and stroke. So the more triglycerides, the more fat you have in your bloodstream, and the more likely or more prone you are to getting heart disease, heart attack, stroke, things like that. Blood pressure is also, as you can see, much lower in the calorie-restricted individual. The glucose levels and insulin levels are also much better. These are measures of the amount of sugar floating in your bloodstream and how well your body can regulate that sugar in your bloodstream. As you can see, much healthier in the calorie-restricted person. C-reactive protein is another one of these overall health measures. Body mass index as well, much better in the calorie-restricted person, as well as body fat percentage. And this was all done on men and after only 6 years of the calorie-restricted diet. But the idea is that because it does mimic what we've seen in other organisms, that perhaps this won't just make you healthier, but also result in a longer lifespan, especially if you're able to stick with it for your entire life. So if you're interested in this kind of diet and living an overall healthier, much longer life, that could be up to 50% longer. So if you think about it, the typical lifespan is 75, 80 years. If you could add another 40 years to that, you could live a healthy life up to 110, 120 years old. And that's on average. So maybe there might be people that would live even longer on the calorie-restricted diet. There are some people trying this out. And as I mentioned earlier, this is part of the Calorie Restriction Diet Society. These two are individuals that are regularly seen in lots of articles and stories. They also have their own website dedicated to the cause. They've advocated for the calorie restricted diet because of some other effects that they've seen as well. So in these articles, they are very strong proponents of the calorie restricted diet because they've said that in model organisms, we've seen reduced cancer rates. As I mentioned, improved cardiovascular health, like lower blood pressure, lower cholesterol, and lower triglycerides. They've also mentioned that in addition to the lower insulin, which means less diabetes, that there's also an improved memory. So they've also mentioned that there appears to be a reduced Alzheimer's risk in the rats, mice, and primates as well. Downsides of the diet is that there have been some reports of loss of muscle and bone mass. So you can see from these two individuals that they are fairly thin, not a lot of muscle mass to their bodies, but that's part of the consequence of the calorie restriction diet. Also possibly more likely to break a bone or a hip or something as they get older because of the loss of bone mass. It's also a little difficult to replicate these results, so it's still questionable if it works in humans. But if you're interested in something like this, you can end up joining the Calorie Restriction Society. The Calorie Restriction Society advocates for very closely regulating your food intake. And I really like this picture because you don't see them sitting in front of food, you actually see them sitting in front of a laptop. And that's because individuals in the Calorie Restriction Society end up spending a huge portion of their daily routine monitoring all of the nutrients and macromolecules that they take into their bodies to make sure that every single nutrient is accounted for, and that they are able to consume all of the required foods that they need to eat, and nutrients that they need to eat every day. So for instance, if you have ever gone to the grocery store expecting to buy some spinach and they're out of spinach, you're probably thinking, oh, I'll just get some chard or some lettuce or something like that instead. Whereas these individuals, they've analyzed all of the nutrient content of the spinach. And so if they can't buy spinach for whatever reason, they have to figure out exactly how much of some other food item to eat in order to account for the nutrients that they're missing out of that spinach. The Calorie Restriction Society states that a typical diet in America, as I'm sure you know, and advocates for 2,000 calories for every male and 1,800 calories for every female. Part of the reason why there's a discrepancy between males and females is that the FDA acknowledges that males are on average taller and so bigger and heavier, and also that they do tend to have bigger muscle and bone mass because of their testosterone. So the 2,000 calorie diet that the FDA and USDA recommends is actually for men, and women should have a little bit less. But the calorie restriction diet is based on restricting the calories. What they advocate for is for men to just eat 1,600 calories per day, and women eat 1,200 calories per day. So, no cheat days, never any more than that. They don't just eat less food. Their food is based on a very strict regimen, making sure that they do consume the proper amount of nutrients. So they avoid flour completely. That includes all pastas, all breads for the rest of their life. Right? No cookies, no cakes or anything like that. No sugars, no processed sugar, no honey, no agave, no types of sugar at all, except for that they may acquire through fruits. They do eat a lot of leafy green vegetables, if that's something that you noticed from the primate study. Lots of leafy green vegetables and other vegetables that are lower in calories, lower in carbohydrates, but really high in nutrients. They eat just enough protein in order to supply their protein requirements. Animal protein is more complete, but higher in calories and fat. And so they do try to get their protein from tofu or beans or other sources like that. They do need to eat fat. That's a required part of their diet. You're not required to eat carbohydrates, but your body does require fat consumption. But the fats that they consume are almost entirely omega-3s and monounsaturated fats. They try to avoid saturated fats completely. And they also recommend that if you are interested in this type of diet, that you transition into the diet very slowly and you maintain the diet every day for the rest of your life. You never stray from the diet. If you decide that you don't like the diet anymore and you want to come off of it, you need to come off of the diet very slowly as well. And they say that if you start the diet really quickly or come off of the diet really quickly by maybe breaking your diet by eating a cookie or something like that, that can actually shorten your lifespan because it's a big shock to the system. So what we're going to talk about in the next section is what the biological basis of this calorie restriction diet might be, and then also a few controversies that we have in nutrition today.